Imagine it's 3rd of July 2015. You are a 77-year-old retiree living in Thessaloniki, Greece. Your name is Georgos Chatzifotiadis, and in your pocket is a savings book, an identity card, and the hope of collecting your wife's €120 pension. For years, your life has moved in small, careful circles. A trip to the bank, a stop for bread, a check on the bills, a quiet talk at home about what can wait and what cannot. You once worked hard in Germany, first in a coal mine and later in a foundry, and now old age is supposed to be the season when life finally gets simpler. The money is not meant for luxury. It is for groceries, medicine, bus fare, and the small dignity of not having to ask your children for help. The banks are supposed to be the safe part of the world, like a stone wall around ordinary people. But that morning the wall does not look like stone. It looks like paper in the rain. If you have ever wondered why some people seem to get safer just before everyone else gets scared, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern. It has happened in different countries in different decades under different flags. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. You go from one bank to another, then a fourth. At each one, the answer is the same. No cash, no access, no exception. When you are finally told you cannot withdraw the €120, you collapse in tears on the pavement. The photograph travels around the world because it captures something bigger than one man outside one branch. It captures the moment when a private fear becomes a public fact. By the time ordinary people are standing in line, the real move has already happened somewhere else. Quietly, behind closed doors, in wire transfers, foreign accounts, gold purchases, land deals, and short lists of assets that do not depend on one frightened banking system. This video is about that move. Not in the language of rumor or conspiracy, but in the language of history. What rich people secretly buy before markets begin to panic is usually not excitement. It is distance. Distance from a falling currency. Distance from a trapped bank. Distance from a promise that may not survive the week. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Market panic almost never starts on the trading floor. It starts in trust. Trust is the invisible floor under the whole house. When people believe the money in the bank will still be money tomorrow, the floor feels solid. When they begin to doubt it, even quietly, the floor starts to flex. Most people do not notice the flex. Wealthier people often do, and when they do, they stop asking the question most savers ask, which is, what pays the best return? They start asking a different question, which is, what still works if the local promise breaks? That question changes everything. History shows that before visible panic, wealthy households, connected insiders, and experienced operators often move into 3 broad kinds of safety. First, they buy money that the local government cannot print more of. That can mean US dollars, Swiss francs, or gold. Second, they buy assets that do not vanish when a bank closes or a currency melts. That can mean land, mines, factories, prime property, or shares in businesses with real earnings abroad. Third, they buy escape routes, not just airplane tickets, financial escape routes, a foreign bank account, a foreign branch, a second legal home for their savings, access to a system outside the one that is cracking. Think of a struggling financial system like a theater with one narrow exit. Most people are still watching the stage. They are listening to speeches from ministers, central bankers, television anchors, and bank executives. The wealthy are not necessarily smarter, but they are often closer to the door. They can see the smoke first, and they can move before the crowd stands up. The public thinks the panic starts when people run. In reality, the panic starts when the people near the exit quietly stop enjoying the show. This brings us directly to the first part of the pattern. When trust in money itself begins to rot, the wealthy do not cling harder to paper claims. They reach for things with weight. Look at Germany after the First World War. On the surface, the story most people remember is simple. Wheelbarrows of cash, bread prices exploding, life savings turning into dust. That happened. But underneath that chaos, another story was unfolding. One that looked less like ruin and more like a transfer of power. Before the war, one US dollar bought about 4.2 German marks. By November 1923, $1 bought 4.2 trillion marks. The currency did not merely weaken, it dissolved. Britannica notes that by July 1922, prices had already risen by around 700%, and by November 1923, the mark had become so worthless that a wheelbarrow of money could not reliably buy a newspaper. The Bundesbank describes workers being paid daily, then rushing with bags and suitcases to spend their wages before the notes lost more value. Traders changed prices constantly. Farmers refused to sell for worthless money. Businesses stopped trading. pensioners starved. The money was still there in a technical sense, but it no longer held still long enough to serve as money. Now here is where it gets interesting. Hyperinflation, which means prices rising so fast that money becomes useless faster than people can spend it, does not hit everyone the same way. It punishes savers and fixed-income households first. If your wealth is a salary, a pension, a savings account, or a bond, you are tied to the burning paper. But if your wealth is debt borrowed in the collapsing currency and assets that rise with the price level, you are standing on a different boat. No figure captures this better than Hugo Stinnes, the German industrialist often called the inflation king. Stinnes did not wait for the storm sirens. He built his strategy inside the pressure drop that came before them. Britannica records that after World War I, he came to control coal mines, steel mills, hotels, electrical factories, newspapers, shipping lines, and banks. The Atlantic described his empire as a vertical trust, meaning he tried to own every step from raw materials to distribution. Coal, shipping, steel, utilities, paper mills, newspapers, hotels, transport. He was not collecting trophies. He was collecting pieces of the real economy. Why did that matter? Because when the currency is rotting, paper promises die first and real things reprice. A mine still produces coal. A ship still carries goods. A newspaper still has printing presses. A power utility still sells electricity. Inflation is like acid poured onto a photograph. The faces blur first. The metal frame lasts longer. Stinnes borrowed heavily in marks and acquired assets whose value moved with the crisis. Research on the German inflation shows that inflation wiped out more than half of firm leverage, meaning the real burden of company debts collapsed. Debtors were relieved, creditors were crushed. The state's own war debt, according to the Bundesbank, shrank from 154 billion marks to just 15.4 Pfennig in real terms when the Rentenmark was introduced. The state escaped through inflation. So did major debtors with hard assets. Small savers did not. Ordinary Germans experienced this as a kind of slow robbery carried out in daylight. Nothing dramatic had to be stolen from the kitchen table because the theft happened in the measuring stick itself. The ruler was shrinking while people were trying to measure their lives with it. The middle class, which had done what responsible citizens are told to do, save money, hold bonds, live carefully, was gutted. Salaries lagged behind prices. Pension payments turned absurd. Families sold furniture, jewelry, and coats for food. Yet at the same time, some industrial firms expanded, and some owners of leveraged assets saw their positions strengthen. That is the first secret history inside market panic. Before the public sees collapse, the wealthy often move out of claims on money and into claims on reality. Not because they love drama, because they know that when trust in currency breaks, a paper fortune can evaporate like water on a hot street, while land, energy, machinery, export income, and foreign currency keep their shape. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. If you had lived in Germany in 1922, would you have felt richer holding a thick stack of banknotes or poorer? Drop your answer in the comments, seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. The second move rich people make before panic is even more important than buying hard assets. They buy outside money before the doors lock. To see this clearly, go to Argentina in 2001. For years, Argentina tried to hold its peso steady against the US dollar. A currency peg, which means tying one currency to another at a fixed value, can make a country look stable for a while. It is a bit like painting cracks on a wall the same color as the wall. The room looks fine until the pressure gets worse. By the late 1990s and 2001, debt was rising, recession had taken hold, and faith in the banking system was beginning to slip. That loss of faith did not begin with rioters in the street. It began with withdrawals. The IMF records that between November 28th and November 30th, 2001, private sector deposits in Argentina fell by more than $3.6 billion, about 6% of the deposit base, in just 3 days. That is not normal caution. That is a sprint for the exits. And when the authorities responded, they did what frightened systems often do. They froze the crowd. On December 3rd, 2001, the government imposed the corralito, which means the little corral. Under the new restrictions, people could withdraw only 250 pesos or dollars in cash per week from their bank accounts. The Reuters summary of the wider crisis notes that around $40 billion of deposits were frozen as the meltdown deepened into 2002. Pause on that word, corral. It tells you everything. A corral is a fence built to keep movement under control. Ordinary Argentines woke up to discover that money in the bank and money in the hand were no longer the same thing. On paper, they had savings. In real life, they had permission slips. Look at what happened next. Riots broke out, ATMs were vandalized, supermarkets were looted. Reuters notes that the freeze tossed millions of middle-class Argentines into poverty, and that the protests and riots in December 2001 ended with more than 20 people dead, and President Fernando de la Rua resigning. This was not only a financial crisis, it was a social shattering. When access to money becomes uncertain, the whole rhythm of ordinary life breaks apart. Rent, payroll, medicine, transport, food. Each becomes a small emergency. But even in that chaos, the pattern remains. Argentines with access to US dollars outside the domestic banking trap, or with the ability to move funds abroad before the restrictions hardened, stood on firmer ground than those who trusted the local system to stay open. Reuters reported years later that the memory of the Corralito drove Argentines to stash savings at home, often in dollars, and that foreign currency deposits rose from 4% of GDP in 2016 to 8% in 2019 during another period of stress. The memory was not irrational. It was learned behavior from a historical wound. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. The rich do not always buy glamorous assets before panic. Sometimes they buy something much duller. Cash in the right currency, not the local currency everyone uses. The outside currency everyone runs to when confidence goes thin. In Argentina, the secret purchase was often not art, yachts, or luxury apartments. It was the boring power of the dollar bill, the green note in a drawer. The foreign account, the ability to pay in a unit that did not depend on one desperate government. That is why market panic feels so unfair when it finally arrives. By the time officials tell the public not to worry, the people with the most options have often already worried in private and acted on it. The crowd gets lectures. The wealthy get liquidity. Liquidity, in plain English, means ready cash you can actually use right now. It is the difference between owning water on paper and holding a bottle in a drought. This leads to the second part of this story. Sometimes the rich are not just buying hard money, they are buying reach. Reach across borders. Reach across institutions. Reach beyond one national banking system. That is exactly what Greece reveals. In late 2009, deposits in Greek banks were above 240 billion euros. By April 2015, Reuters reported that they had fallen to 139.4 billion euros, the lowest level in more than a decade. In just 1 month, April 2015, another 5.6 billion euros left. And according to Yale's detailed study of the crisis, from December 2014 to June 28, 2015, Greek banks lost 47.6 billion euros in deposits, or 27.5% of their deposit base. Think of a reservoir draining beneath a city while people on the streets are still arguing about the weather. The public face of the crisis came on June 28, 2015. Greece announced a bank holiday, which is a polite phrase for forced bank closure, and imposed capital controls, meaning strict limits on taking cash out or moving money abroad. Reuters reported that ATM withdrawals were capped at 60 euros a day for holders of Greek bank cards. Yale notes that even during the holiday, while people stayed under the daily limit, another 2.8 billion euros still came out. The panic was no longer hidden. It had become a cue. This is why the image of Giorgos Chatzifotiadis matters so much. He was not crying because he had made a reckless bet. He was crying because the basic contract of normal life had been broken in public. According to reports at the time, he had queued at bank after bank trying to withdraw his wife's 120 euro pension, and finally collapsed when he was refused again. He spoke not only of his own distress, but of seeing fellow citizens begging for bread. That is what financial failure looks like at ground level. Not charts, not bond spreads. A man too old for economic theory, standing in front of a locked system. Yet while that human drama was visible, another pattern was visible only if you stepped back. People with more means had been moving earlier. Some withdrew cash, some shifted deposits abroad. Some had foreign cards or accounts beyond the immediate grip of Greek controls. Some owned assets outside Greece altogether. The exact mix differed from family to family, but the logic was the same. If one ship looks unstable, you do not argue with the paint. You put one foot on another deck. There is an important lesson in the Greek case. The rich often buy optionality before panic. Optionality is a complicated word for a simple thing. The ability to choose when other people no longer can. If your cash is trapped in one domestic bank, you have no choice. If you have money in more than one country, more than one currency, or more than one legal system, you have room to breathe. Wealth, in these moments, is not just about size. It is about angles of escape. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for. The part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. Germany in 1923, Argentina in 2001, Greece in 2015, different countries, different decades, different political stories, same mechanism. First, the weakness builds quietly. A currency peg strains. A debt load rises. Foreign reserves thin out. Political credibility falls. The building still stands, but the beams are already soft. Second, the best connected money starts moving before the public sees a crisis. In Weimar Germany, large operators shifted into real assets and debt structures that inflation would erase. In Argentina, people who could move toward dollars and away from dependence on local bank access. In Greece, deposit outflows accelerated long before the bank holiday made the danger obvious to everyone. Third, the state eventually chooses which promises to break. That is the hidden center of these stories. Panic is not random lightning. It is a sorting machine. In Germany, savers and people on fixed incomes were sacrificed through inflation. In Argentina, depositors were fenced in by withdrawal limits. In Greece, account holders were trapped behind capital controls. The promise that breaks may be different, but there is almost always a broken promise. And fourth, the wealthy rarely protect themselves by being brave. They protect themselves by being early. That is a very different thing. History does not show rich people as prophets with crystal balls. It shows them as people with better information, better networks, more flexibility, and fewer illusions about how quickly official reassurance can evaporate. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. Before the market panic appears on television, the real market vote has already been cast in private actions, wire transfers, foreign exchange purchases, gold orders, property closings, debt refinancings, quiet calls to lawyers and bankers. The crash that shocks the public often feels sudden only because the preparation phase was silent. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. But there is one more layer, and it may be the most important of all. Who actually pays for these episodes when the music stops? The answer, again and again, is the same classes of people: middle-class savers, pensioners, small business owners, families with one apartment, one salary, one bank, and no backup system. They are the people standing barefoot when the tide goes out. Cyprus in 2013 shows this brutally. After years of reckless banking and heavy exposure to Greek debt, the island's banking system imploded. In March 2013, banks shut and the country moved toward a bailout. Reuters later reported that on July 30, 2013, Cyprus's central bank confirmed that 47.5% of deposits above 100,000 euros at Bank of Cyprus would be converted into equity, meaning large uninsured depositors took a major forced loss to recapitalize the bank. That threshold matters. Deposits under 100,000 euros were supposed to be protected under European rules. Above that line, the haircut fell. But even before the final haircut figure was announced, Reuters described money leaking out through every crack. While ordinary Cypriots queued at cash machines to withdraw a few hundred euros, large sums left through London branches, Russian affiliates, and special transfers. One participant in the negotiations said that by Sunday there was almost no capital left in Laiki, the second largest bank at the center of the crisis. Think about that image. The front door was locked for the crowd, but side doors were still swinging for those who knew the layout. A bank in crisis is like a sinking ship where first class somehow still has access to the lifeboat manifest. Cyprus matters because it destroyed a comforting myth. Many people assumed that in modern Europe, bank deposits were a sacred promise. Yet when the system became too expensive to save, the promise bent. Not for everyone equally, but it bent. Lebanon makes the same point in an even harsher way. For years, the country offered unusually high interest rates and lived on inflows of dollars, remittances, and confidence. Reuters described the model as something some economists called a nationally regulated Ponzi scheme, which means new money coming in was used to support old obligations until the inflow slowed. By the onset of the crisis, Lebanon's debt burden was about 150% of national output. When protests erupted in October 2019 and dollar inflows dried up, banks could no longer meet the claims piled against them. Doors closed. Informal capital controls spread. Depositors found that their dollars were trapped or accessible only at a huge discount. And then came the part ordinary people never forget. While students struggled to send tuition abroad and depositors were blocked from moving funds, well-connected people were not trapped in the same way. Reporting on the crisis noted that by early September 2019, some depositors were already being denied access to dollars, and Al Arabiya cited former banker Dan Azi saying one politically exposed person transferred $273 million out of a top Lebanese bank in December 2019 after de facto controls had already begun. One transfer, $273 million, in a country where many households later fought for a few $100s a week. That is not just inequality, it is a separate financial universe. Reuters reported that Lebanon's currency, long pegged near 1,500 to the dollar, had fallen to about 23,000 on the street by January 2022, after hitting 34,000 earlier that month. Savings were not merely frozen, they were hollowed out, prices rose, poverty spread. Banks became fortresses against their own customers. For ordinary Lebanese, the crisis felt like being locked inside a house while the walls were quietly sold brick by brick. So who walks away fine? Usually people with at least one of four shields: foreign income, foreign accounts, real assets, political connection, sometimes two or three at once. Who gets cornered? People whose entire financial life sits inside one domestic balance sheet. And the cruelest part is that the damage rarely arrives all at once. It arrives like an elevator stopping between floors. First there is inconvenience, then delay, then rationing, then humiliation. In Argentina, the weekly cash cap did not just hurt abstract depositors. It hurt shopkeepers who needed notes for suppliers, parents who needed cash for food, and workers paid in a system that no longer matched real life. In Greece, the €60 daily limit sounded small and technical until you imagined an elderly person without a bank card, or a family trying to buy medicine, fuel, and groceries one day at a time. In Cyprus, businesses and households with balances above the insured threshold did not simply lose money. Many were turned into unwilling shareholders in a damaged bank, which is a bit like trying to save a drowning man by tying him to the anchor. In Lebanon, depositors discovered that even if the number on the statement remained large, access to the money could shrink to a trickle. Small business owners are often hit especially hard in these episodes because they live between two clocks. One clock is the state's emergency rules, the other is the real world's demand for payment. Staff must still be paid, rent still comes due, inventory still has to be bought. A bakery cannot tell the flour supplier that the central bank needs more time. A pharmacist cannot hand over a government decree instead of medicine. When money stops circulating normally, the first victims are often not speculators. They are the people who keep daily life stitched together. Pensioners suffer in a different way. Their problem is not only access, it is time. A pensioner cannot simply work another decade to rebuild what inflation or controls destroy. In Weimar Germany, pensioners and salaried savers were among the clearest losers because their claims stayed fixed while prices ran away. In Greece, the image that traveled the world was not a hedge fund manager locked out of a terminal. It was an old man crying over €120. History keeps returning to the same point with almost theatrical cruelty. The people who trusted the system most faithfully are often the ones the system can most easily trap. Now place beside them the people who usually remain steadier, the shipping family with foreign earnings, the industrial owner with debt in local currency and assets linked to export prices, the politically connected depositor who gets approval for a transfer while students are told to wait, the household with cash abroad, property abroad, or relatives sending money from abroad. They have beams in other buildings. That is why these crises widen class divisions so fast. The middle class often believes it owns a solid ladder upward. In a panic, that ladder can turn out to be painted cardboard. Meanwhile, the truly insulated are not clinging to salaries or bank promises alone. They are holding claims on harder things and wider systems. By the time the public realizes the floor is shifting, the distribution of pain has already been decided. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. So what did the survivors do differently? Not the lucky few who guessed a date on a calendar, the ones who came through these periods with most of their position intact. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods largely shared three characteristics. First, they did not confuse a claim with a thing. A bank balance is a claim. It is a statement that an institution owes you money. Most of the time, that is enough. In calm times, the claim feels identical to the thing itself. But crisis teaches the difference brutally. Gold in your possession, productive land, foreign currency cash, shares in firms with real overseas earnings, these are not the same as a promise from a weak bank in a weak system. The survivors understood that distinction before the crowd did. Second, they avoided putting their entire life inside one box, one bank, one currency, one country, one political outcome. The people who fared best in Argentina often had access to dollars outside the banking freeze. The people with room in Greece often had assets or banking relationships beyond the domestic system. In Lebanon, families with relatives abroad, outside income, or access to fresh dollars had options that ordinary depositors did not. In Weimar Germany, industrial players with debt in marks and ownership of real assets occupied the opposite side of the disaster from pensioners holding paper claims. They were not standing in the same storm, even if they shared the same map. Third, they moved before panic became a social event. This may be the deepest lesson of all. Once there are queues, headlines, emergency speeches, and daily withdrawal caps, the cheap exits are gone. Safety becomes expensive or impossible. The wealthy often look brilliant in hindsight, not because they predicted the future with perfect accuracy, but because they respected fragility sooner. Fragility means something that looks strong until stress hits it. A wine glass on a shelf is stable until the shelf shakes. The survivors studied the shelf. Notice what is missing from this list. Heroic risk, secret genius, complex trading strategies. In many historical episodes, the winning move was boring. Hold the harder currency, own the real asset, own. Reduce dependence on one shaky institution. Keep some part of life outside the immediate blast radius. The people who preserved wealth were often not chasing the highest return. They were buying resilience, which simply means the ability to absorb a shock without breaking. And this is why the title of this video matters so much. What rich people secretly buy before markets begin to panic is often not a luxury object at all. It is a quieter form of power. The power to wait, the power to leave, the power to refuse a forced sale, the power to say, when everyone else is trapped, I do not have to act today. Bring the story back to Thessaloniki. An old man stands outside a bank asking for 120 euros that already belongs to his household. He has done what the modern world asked him to do: work hard, save, use the banking system, trust the institutions. And yet, at the moment of stress, trust turns out to be a bridge made of smoke. That is the lesson running through Weimar Germany, Argentina, Cyprus, Greece, and Lebanon. Panic is the public phase of a much earlier private migration. The market does not begin to panic when television says so. It begins to panic when people with the most room to move quietly stop wanting the same promises as everyone else. They shift into harder money, harder assets, and wider escape routes. Then later, the public discovers that the doors are narrower than they looked. None of this means history repeats in the same costume. It does not. Each country has its own laws, politics, balance sheets, and breaking points, but the rhyme is hard to miss. When debt is heavy, trust is thin, and official reassurance gets louder, those closest to the fault line often stop reaching for yield and start reaching for survival. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.